The Church of Mavis Radio Show, Friday nights at 8 p.m., 7 Central, starring Jeffrey Pritchett with his co-hosts Wham and Jay McNicholas, right here on the United Paranormal Radio Network, UPRN 107.7 FM, New Orleans.
You're listening to UFO Undercover with your host, Joe Montaldo, right here on the Paranormal Radio Network.
Welcome to the Gateway, broadcasting live from the edge of the Mojave, where the strange slips through the cracks. We are live on United Radio Public Network 107.7 FM New Orleans, and I'm your host, C.L. Thomas. Tonight's guest, this is going to be such an interesting show, and I've been looking forward to this for a very long time. She's a historian, medium, a paranormal investigator, and lecturer, and her specialty is the Fox sisters. But before we get into our topic, you've been listening to Into the Night with Sean Kelly. Currently, it's 48 degrees here in the Mojave. It's a perfect night for the hot tub, which I have a date tonight at 7 o'clock to go do that with some friends. So I can't wait. I just got back from Wyoming this week. We were a little bit north of Cheyenne in a small little town called Torrington. So I have some friends. Actually, it's my brother from another mother. He's starting a homestead up that way. And so I went up there to look at some of the possibilities. And along the way, we went to Fort Laramie. It's a National Historic Site. And, I didn't take any paranormal investigative equipment with me this time, not even a recorder. I just took myself. But it's one of those places where you could tell right away that it has a lot of activity going on with it. Originally, it was established as a private fur trading fort, I think in like 1830s. And then it evolved and it became like the main track for the Oregon Trail, the railroad, and all sorts of other things like that. So it was kind of like a central gathering place where Native Americans and Westerners, the Mormons were using that route. Everybody essentially going going west from the East Coast. They were going through St. Louis and heading out toward the Oregon Trail and all that stuff. But anyway, it was kind of neat to witness this firsthand, and it's kind of like stepping back in time and seeing the fort for what it was. It was like America's Western expansion, and you got to see like the Indian resistance to encroachment on their territories and things like that firsthand. And I think I read somewhere that there was a massacre that even occurred on this fort involving the Native Americans from the U.S. military. So you just had a lot of activity going on. It was really neat. It was really cold. I think one night that we were there, we got a snowstorm and it got down to like 3 degrees. So I feel like I got to experience the true Wyoming. But anyway, enough of that. Tonight's guest, historian, medium, and paranormal investigator, joins me tonight to discuss the Fox sisters. To give you a little bit of a background, I visited Lilydale over the summer for the first time, and I've always been engrossed in the spiritualism movement of the early or late 18th century, I should say. And it largely got started, from my understanding, in America anyway, because this stuff has always gone on in England prior to the Fox sisters. But yeah, spiritualism has really taken hold in America by this little strange cabin from 3 sisters. And the cabin, or what used to be the cabin, was moved to Lilydale and then for preservation. And at some point in time, I don't know exactly when, that cabin burned down. So now what's there is like a plaque, and there's like a little memorial to the Fox sisters. But anyway, long story short, I feel like the Fox sisters kind of got a bad rap throughout history, and we're going to get into that this hour. So let me get her on here. Tracy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on. Can you tell I'm like stumbling over words?
I'm very excited to be on.
So, to get us started, you were the caretaker of the cabin, and that's the cabin behind you.
Yes, that is the cottage behind me. That's the original cottage. There's a lot of different people that will say, "Oh, I remember the Fox cottage." Well, they remember the replica. This is the original Fox cottage.
Mm-hmm. So, was the replica what sat at Lilydale?
So the original moved there in 1916.
Okay. So that was the original. You kind of faded out there when you said that. See,
sorry.
Every time we talk about anything haunted on this channel, things like this start happening. Just so you know.
Okay, I'm used to it.
So, okay, you said that the cabin was moved to Lilydale when?
In 1916.
Okay, and then it burned down.
I believe it was I want to say 55.
So it's been quite some time.
Yeah, yep.
Now, when you were caretaker of this place, was it in Lilydale or was it still in Hydesville?
Neither.
Oh.
Neither. I know, right? So I am the caretaker of the property and the enclosure that protects the original foundation.
Okay.
So the original foundation from 1814 is still there today. And, as the story goes, a lot happened in the basement, which is what is preserved in the enclosure that is on the property today.
Got it. And how did you get involved in this? Let's back up a little bit and talk about you a little bit. How did you come into, first of all, mediumship, and how did you get connected with the Fox sisters in the first place?
So I grew up in Newark, and my family, we always went to the Lutheran church. And so I was, I grew up in the Lutheran church. I was baptized there. I was confirmed and all that fun stuff. But I always felt like there was something more. And I would ask, my aunt, who was also the secretary of the church, I would ask her questions. And I think the one question that really threw her off was, in my 11, 12-year-old mind, if the Virgin Mary was a virgin, how did she have a baby? So you can imagine that did not go over well. But I just knew there was more. And my best friend, whose name is also Tracy, we started going to the Fox property. And at that time, it was in the 80s. And there was a gentleman that was living there in the replica cottage. And he had come, his name was John Drummond. He was a spiritualist. He organized a church and a spiritualist community on the property. And he built a replica of the Fox cottage. So he would talk to you about anything, and he loved to talk about spiritualism and the Fox sisters. He loved religion in general, and he was very knowledgeable, but he was also kind of like a little hermit, very introverted, and, to know him was to love him. He was a great guy. So we just started going to the property. And as we got older, she was going to the Catholic church. I'm going to the Lutheran church. And one day I just said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to go find my religion, whatever it is. And, I think as young girls, we started out, as looking into paganism, and then, we just kind of were really into nature. And then I got very interested in spiritualism. And I think by the time I was in my late teens, I pretty much knew this was the path that I was headed, which is not always an easy path.
It's really not.
Mm-mm.
It's kind of difficult. It's really hard trying to explain it to people as well, because they all think that even in this day and age, everyone's afraid of the spiritualist movement and the church.
Yes.
It's very strange. But
it is very strange. Yes.
Even when you compare the two religions, I talk with another friend of mine about this all the time. Most people are Christian, and this isn't a knock on Christianity by any means, but when you pull that apart, your faith is in somebody, like you said, that's been born of virgin birth, who was nailed to a cross to save you, and now you have to drink his blood as a vampire and commune with him. It's very strange, but then they don't believe in ghosts or anything.
Right. Yeah. It to me, it's very strange. And, I always say that for me, spiritualism, I never had to rely on blind faith, because as a medium, you can see and hear and experience things that most people can't. And so, my aunt, she was the best. I loved her. And she would just say, that's just the way it is. That's what the Bible teaches us. And I just thought, gosh, there's got to be so much more. And, and whenever I went to the property, I just felt at ease, at peace. And I always say, when I'm there, I feel like I'm home. And it's a really difficult feeling to describe, but I see it on people's faces when they visit. It's like, the boulders come off the shoulder, and, people are lighter, and smiles come easier. And, there's no worries for that amount of time that you're there. There's just this peaceful feeling from that property.
That's really interesting, particularly because, when you look at the history of this place and what it set off with the Fox sisters, it could be set up as the perfect crime and in haunted history, actually.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of, well, I don't want to say a lot of different families, but there were two major families that actually lived in the cottage before the Fox sisters. The most significant, I think, is the Bell family. And Mr. and Mrs. Bell had a young girl that stayed with them. Her name was Lucretia. She was 15, and she stayed with them Monday through Friday in exchange for her room. She did chores. So she would go to school. Her parents lived in the village. She stayed with the Bells, and she would go to school, do some chores, and then her parents would come get her on the weekends. And then one day, a peddler showed up, and for them, that was in-home shopping. That was like QVC 100%, without the TV. And he showed up, and, by all accounts, they say that Mrs. Bell greeted him as if he were an old friend. And so maybe her husband was jealous. We don't really know what took place. But we know that all of a sudden Lucretia was going home, and Mrs. Bell was going to take her, and she was very upset. And she had asked the peddler, when you're in the village in the next few days, would you stop at my father's so I can purchase this this thread and the fabric that I would like that you have? And he said, oh, of course, no problem. But he never showed up. And so it was a surprise to her, one, that he never showed up, and two, Mrs. Bell came back and said, oh gosh, we made a big mistake. We want you to come back to the house. And so on their way back, she was a teenager. So she was, sullen. basically Mrs. Bell was like, what's wrong? And she said, well, geez, you're over there boasting about all the things you got from the peddler, and he never showed up at my dad's. And, she was like, oh, gee, too bad for you, whatever. And it was later that night that Lucretia started experiencing this manifestation of knocking noises. And, she was hearing like dragging in at night in the hallway, and experiencing cold, drafts and things like that. She had actually gone into the cellar and fell in a hole. And when she screamed, Mrs. Bell kind of yelled at her and was like, what is your problem? And she said, there's a giant hole down here. I just fell for your dinner. And, Mrs. Bell was like, oh gosh, it must be the rats. And she ordered her husband to go and get fill dirt and field stones and fill in the holes. Many years after this, we did find out that, by the Fox sisters, when they finally moved in, and, they were brave enough to communicate with these rapping noises, they found out that it was the peddler. It was the spirit of the peddler. He had been murdered. He said it was Mr. Bell, and that he had been buried in the basement. And, that's where a lot of people think that the story ended. But for the Fox sisters, it didn't. It was obviously just the beginning, because from there, they went on, to be mediums. They moved in with their older sister, Leah. She kind of wormed her way in and became their manager. They went on world tours and started doing seances and circles. And it wasn't until after that Katie and Maggie had passed that the bones of the peddler were found in the crumbling basement walls back in Hydesville.
So if the Fox sisters knew that person was in, or they just kind of left them in there?
So when they asked him where he was and what had happened, he said, I was murdered by Mr. Bell. He cut my throat and took my money and buried me in the basement. Well, they went, not the girls, but their father and their brother, they went into the basement and they started digging. And first of all, we're looking at March 31st, 1848. So it's cold. There's probably snow on the ground. They're digging in the basement, and all they're getting is water. So they have to stop. They try again in April. They try again in July, but they just never get anywhere. So it wasn't until 1904 when there were kids in the basement playing around, and one of them fell into a wall. And it's what we call the fourth wall, or the false wall. And the bones of the peddler came out from behind this wall. So he wasn't necessarily in the ground. He was behind a wall.
Got it. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you have these, it was two sisters initially, right? That started off the whole thing. And It started with them kind of almost being haunted in this cabin with the rapping.
Yes. So they moved in, and the first thing their mother said was, oh my gosh, this house is haunted. And for her to say that, in 1847, that was almost like a no-no. You didn't talk about those things. And they were hearing the manifestations right away. At first it sounded like someone knocking on the wall, and then the door, and then the window. Their father would investigate and would find nothing. And it just went on and on and on for months until, finally March 31st, their mother said, listen, we're going to bed early. I don't want to hear a word about this. If you hear the noises, keep it to yourself, because I'm tired of it. And basically they're all getting ready for bed, and they hear the noises again. And it was Kate, the youngest daughter. She was 9 at the time, and she yelled out, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do. and she clapped her hands 3 times, and she heard an immediate 3 claps. And then her sister Maggie, who was 12 at the time, she said, "Do as I do." And she clapped her hands 4 times, but she didn't make a sound. And she heard an immediate 4 claps. And then she yelled out, "Oh, Mother, look, it can see as well as hear us." So from there, they say that Mrs. Fox's hair turned white within 48 hours. I believe it. I believe it. But, you know, Mrs. Fox came in and her husband came in, and he's like, "What's going on?" And, you know, she's like, "Oh my gosh, the noises, the rappings are answering the children." And, you know, he was like, "Oh, this is nonsense." And, you know, even Kate, she said, "I know this, it's April Fool's tomorrow. Someone's trying to trick us." And then Mrs. Fox started asking questions, you know, "How many children do I have?" And she got 7 raps. And she said, "Oh, nope, I only have 6 children." And then her husband said, "Yes, but we had 7, 1 died." So, you know, that kind of set her, "Oh, okay, well, how old am I? How old is my oldest daughter?" And then their son came down. David was the only son, and there was a 14-year difference between him and Maggie. And he came in and he laid out the letters of the alphabet. He was a pretty smart guy for a farmer. And he pointed at each of the letters and he said, "We need to know your name. When I get to the first letter of your name, make a noise." And so he would go through A, B, C. They would hear a rap. They would go back through until they wrote it all out. And it was Charles B. Rosna. He was the peddler. He was married, recently widowed, father of 5. And he told the story of what happened. Eventually, they call the neighbors in. The neighbors are asking questions. You know, and even if people think or thought that the girls were doing this, they're not going to know the answers to these questions.
Mhm.
All of these questions were answered correctly. You know, one of the neighbors, Mrs. Dussel, wanted to know, you know, she said, "Well, how old am I?" And when she got the answer, she was embarrassed because, you know, you're not supposed to ask a lady how old she is, or let alone say it. So, you know, that was some of the things that were going on. And, you know, it wasn't all roses and rainbows. It was a very difficult time for them. They didn't ask for this. This was not cool. You know, it wasn't something you were going to go brag about. And I think that's why the decision was made to go to Rochester. Things there, you know, in the big city were a little more acceptable.
Right. So did they ever find who, did the Bells ever get charged, first of all?
So the Bells, living in the house, in the cottage, their health started to decline. And that was the main reason why they moved. They moved about a half hour away in a very small town called Loch Berlin. And for a while they were doing okay. And then after a bit, you know, they passed away. No charges were ever brought up to him. There are neighbors in Hydesville that gave sworn affidavits that said, you know, "Oh no, Mr. Bell, he was sound mind, sound body. He would very respectful. He would never have done something like this." So, you know, you're kind of taking the neighbor's words against this invisible rapper. Who are you going to believe? You know, and then what are you going to do? Are you going to arrest him because a spirit told you to? I think it was kind of difficult for them to prove it. But I think he lived under that shadow for the rest of his life. You know, people always kind of looking at him sideways like, you know, who knows?
It makes me wonder if he was haunted too in some way.
Maybe. I think that's why they moved, you know, because it wouldn't stop.
So you have the 2 girls who were experiencing all of these things, and then the parents and the neighbors, and it kind of started growing from that. How did it transition to them being on the road and doing seances?
So word got out, not only here in Hydesville, which coincidentally, they had about 500 people in the house within 48 hours, which was pretty cool for no cell phones and things like that.
Yeah.
But people were just lining up day and night to just kind of come in, and they would hear rapping noises, or they would ask questions and have things answered. And their mother was not having this. She was not impressed by any of this at all. And so she sent them to David's house, which is only about 2 miles up the road. His house is still there today. And once they got settled up there, the noises and the rapping, the manifestations started happening at his house. Their daughter, oldest daughter, Leah, she was stopped on the sidewalk in Rochester, and someone had said to her, "Isn't your surname Fox?" And she said, "Yes, it is." And they said, "Your father is John from Hydesville." And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you have any idea what's going on in Hydesville?" And she said, "No." And so he told her, and she literally got on a packet boat, came down the canal into Newark, got on a carriage, and came out to David's house. And it's interesting because the driver of the carriage said, where can I take you? Did you want to go to the old spook house? She said, "No, I want to go to my brother's." She was very naughty. Maggie often said that if Leah was coming, you knew the problem was soon to be solved. She was very much the mother figure to the girls. So she came, and Mrs. Fox said, "Why don't you take Kate? You take her back to Rochester with you, and we're going to put an end to this nonsense." Because at this point, they really thought that the girls were kind of, doing this and somehow rigging things to make it paranormal. And she said, "Okay, fine." Took Kate. They went back to Rochester to her place, and lo and behold, things started happening up there. And within about 2 weeks, word got back to Mrs. Fox, and she said, "This is ridiculous. I need to be with my children." And so she took Maggie, and they went to Rochester. By that time, I think Leah, their older sister, she realized what a gift the girls had, and started arranging meetings for people to come in. And it was just it started out very simple. Like, the neighbor had just lost her husband. "Well, come in. Let's see if the girls can connect with him, and you can talk to him." And that's really how it started. And next thing you know, they're lined up out the door, morning, noon, and night, Monday through Saturday. The only day off they would get was Sundays. And then very influential people in the city found out. And so they started coming in, and the newspaper found out. There were very influential physicians and scientists who basically said, "Okay, let's get them on display. Let's see what's going on." And they rented out Corinthian Hall. It was a big venue, and people paid money to come in and sit, and they put the girls on the stage. So about this time, we're looking at them being about 10 and 13. And they're on the stage, and one of the physicians says, "Go ahead, call your spirits." And so they did, and everyone heard the rapping noises. And then one of the other physicians said, "We know you're making the noises. Take your clothes off." And they made them strip on stage in front of all of these people. And they would continue to hear the rapping noises, and these men would hold their joints because they were convinced they were cracking their toes or their joints or their fingers. And, at the end of the day, they couldn't find any reasonable explanation for how they were doing it. And so they just kind of like, whatever. And I think, at that point, their sister and their mother were like, maybe it's time to move on. And they ended up in New York City. And that's really where their career took off. And, they started to grow up a little bit. And Maggie was the first to fall in love at 16. And, just she didn't have the best life. It was a very tragic ending to her story. Kate was young enough that I think she was absolutely the most powerful of the two. She had much greater gift than Maggie or even Leah. Leah found powers that she didn't know. It was a very difficult time, but they made the best of it. Did they make any money off of it? Absolutely not. They both died penniless, despite working all those hours and doing all the things that, they were doing. It was a difficult life, and especially when they didn't ask for it. It's not like somebody said to them when they were 5, what are you going to be when you grow up? I don't think they were thinking like, oh, we're going to be famous mediums that some people love us and some people don't. So
at one point, it says in the research that I've done for this show that I believe it's Maggie came out and said that she confessed to cracking her knuckles or something like that. But was that more of she came under fire from the people around her, particularly like the physicians? They would have held a really high, they would have been like the high standard in that society.
Absolutely. Yeah. That particular incident happened when the girls were in their 50s. It was 1888, and Maggie had just come home from England. She had been over there just trying to find purpose in her life. And as she was getting off the ship, a reporter approached her and said, "Hey, listen, I know you need money. So I will give you $1,500 if you go on stage and tell everybody that you faked this, that this whole time it's all been a lie." And I think she was just, it was just probably one of those days. And she was like, okay, fine. You got me. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And they went on stage. Maggie went on stage. Kate stayed off to the side. And Maggie just basically stood there and said, yeah, you caught us. We were cracking our toes. We were making all of this up just to scare our mother, and it worked. And then my older sister got involved and she got greedy. And, next thing we knew, we were in this big lie and we didn't know how to stop it. Thankfully, in 1888, there were hundreds of thousands of spiritualists here in America, and probably triple the amount in England. So it was probably like an 80-20 split, where I think 80% of the population was like, there is no way that they faked it for this long. Mm-hmm. And then 20% were like, oh yeah, finally we got them to confess. And that is also where a lot of people think, well, that's it. She confesses, everybody believes that it was fake, and now we can move on with our lives. But 1904 is when, kids were playing in the abandoned house, in the abandoned cottage. And that's when they found the bones of the peddler.
Well, that's so interesting.
To me, it's kind of like a vindication. Like, you made us do this. You made me say this, even though it wasn't true. You got what you wanted. But in the end, I think they really got what they wanted, and that was just for people to believe them.
So because these sisters went through all of this stuff, it kind of really sets the stage for the spiritualism movement in America, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How did that transpire?
So I think because spiritualism was such a huge part of many lives over in England, spiritualism over here it was more modern. So that's why they call it it's modern spiritualism here, because of how it originated in America. And I think for a lot of people, it was very confusing, only because of the times. When you look at all of the things that were going on in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, things were changing all the time. Women didn't have right. They were property. They couldn't own property. But then we got the right to vote, and then we got the right to do certain things. It really kind of set the stage to, hey, maybe there is more religions than just our hardcore, Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, those religions. And I think it allowed people to kind of loosen up a little bit and explore. Maybe you didn't explore, and tell anybody, but you were curious enough to go explore. And then you started to see, smaller groups of spiritualists popping up here, popping up there. Oh no, we're not spiritualists, but we kind of go by the principles. So, I think it kind of depends on the time, like when you're in high school. No, I don't like the color yellow because, my best friend doesn't like yellow. So, it's, what's the flavor of the day? And that's, here in our county, Wayne County in the 1800s was known as the burned over district. And a lot of it was because of the fever of religion that popped up all the time. You would have these Methodist ministers that would ride from town to town and then do these big revivals and then go to the next town and the next town. And people really were kind of getting tired of it. It was almost like, we're going to think for you. Don't do your own thinking. And with modern spiritualism, it was like, well, wait a minute. Now we're thinking outside the box. So this is something new and I want to explore it.
Well, too, I think in that time period, they were so surrounded by death. There was no TV. It was very hard to go to a show or have any kind of outside entertainment other than reading things like the Bible, because even print books were very expensive for most people. Yeah. So what did they have? They had the exploration of the spiritual matters, such as anything church, spiritualism, anything that would draw your attention, I guess, to a loved one that may have crossed over. Because I think I read somewhere, out of each family of 6 or more kids, at least 2 of them had died in that time frame before they reached the age of 18.
Oh gosh, infant mortality in the 1800s. If you made it to the age of 5, you were considered lucky. It was almost like 3 out of 5 children never saw their first birthday. And it's kind of interesting too, because I just did, I was researching on like when you sneeze and, people say, God bless you. I'm like, why do they say God bless you? And it got me into this little, rabbit hole. And it was because, like when you sneezed, people thought, oh my gosh, you're sick. I hope you don't die. Because when you got sick, you died. And so it was their way of like blessing you, God bless you, or good health, which I just found, it's very interesting how it all just goes back to, you had set patterns. Monday through Friday, you worked. Saturday, you did specific things, and Sunday was reserved for church. And that was it. And if you were bored, heaven forbid, you better go get the Bible out. But everything could be, explained by reading the Bible. And, if you don't know any different, then you don't know. And I think, luckily we had these 2 little girls that were just brave enough to say, what happens if we do this? Where maybe, like we had Lucretia Pulver who was hearing these noises, but she was 15, and maybe she was just like, on the cusp of her womanhood. So, she was already destined for a life of housework and children, and, and that was it. Where Maggie and Kate were not. Their future was still, we're not sure what we're going to do with you yet.
Well, the thing is, too, is they were so young and they were women, and they all of a sudden they had this huge audience, which that too was unheard of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And not only did they have an audience, but they had pretty affluent people coming.
They did. Yes, very, very influential people, newspaper people, Quakers. Amy and Isaac Post were huge friends and protectors. The Taylors, Dr. Taylor, he came up with this Swedish cure, and it was for alcoholism and depression. And both Maggie and Kate stayed with him for an extensive amount of time in their late teen, early 20s. Because even back then, people think, oh, they were living in these luxurious hotel rooms in New York City, and, people were dropping, $5 bills to go get a reading with them. But they didn't see it. They didn't get it. Sometimes they were paid with beautiful dresses. Sometimes it was fruit or food or alcohol. And, people think, oh my gosh, they were like 15, 16 years old drinking. Yeah, of course they were. They were considered grown adults. They should have been married at 16. They were old maids. Maggie was 16 when she fell in love with a man who was 30 years old. Nobody blinked an eye because it was acceptable. It was okay. And that was probably her biggest downfall, is that she was 16 and she did fall in love with him, and his family hated her. And it was mostly because she was uneducated and she had no money and she was a spiritualist. So, they just never accepted her. And he married her silently, quietly. He went on a 3-year exploration, and he told her, when I get back, we're going to put an advertisement in the paper. People are going to know that I love you and that we're married, and it's going to be okay. And unfortunately for her, he died on the last 6 months of his 3-year journey. And she found out from the newspaper. Mm. It was the headline on the front page. And they had huge celebrations for him in New York City, in Philadelphia. There were huge parades, and she wasn't included because she wasn't anything to the family.
That's really sad.
Not there, it was devastating. She never, ever, ever recovered from it, ever.
That's so sad.
It is.
Didn't Mary Todd at some point, the president's wife, go and see them?
Well, I'm not sure if she actually saw the sisters. I know that she did have seances in the White House quite frequently. In all of my research, I've never really found anything or read anything that indicates that they were there. But I do know that she did have mediums at the White House and had seances to contact with her son. So I'm not sure. You're not the only person who has said that. I just can't find the information, which, it's back then, it was very difficult to find things like that. And unless it's in a newspaper announcing it, or we have personal diaries, which I don't. Be nice.
And certainly somebody like Mary Todd would not have put that out there, I don't think.
Yeah.
I know right. There's some journals out there that there's another medium named Nettie who she met with at the White House, but even that is very scarce as far as information.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, because you didn't talk about those things, you kept that quiet because you're teetering on the edge of good and evil, God and Satan. You have to be careful. Even telling the story, Mr. Splitfoot is very controversial because Mr. Splitfoot was the devil. And they believed that the devil had the upper torso and head of a man, and the legs were that of a goat. And they had hooves and they were split. So they used to call him Mr. Splitfoot. Kind of not a scary way to say the devil is here.
It's so interesting. I can't even believe we're almost out of time already. Can you believe that?
I can't believe it. I can do this for hours.
I did want to ask you, because you yourself are a medium, and you've been at this property many, many times. Have you yourself ever picked up anything?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. The original caretaker is still there. We're in December now, so he is actually resting. He rests in the winter. Usually around November, he is buried on the property. So I usually go out to his grave, and his wife is right next to him. And I always, say, good night, have a good rest. I'll see you in March. And then usually in March, I go back out there when the snow is less, not up to my chin, and wake him up. But people have seen him and called me and said, there's someone in the enclosure. And I'm like, no, that's impossible. I'm the only one with a key. And I'm like, well, describe who you saw. Oh, he had like white hair and a white t-shirt and khaki pants. And I'm like, oh, that's Mr. Drummond. No problem. Rochester, quite a few years ago, they did a play at the Jiva, I think it was the Jiva Theater. And it was called The House in Hydesville. And our enclosure had just been up for maybe a year. And I remember before we went to see the play, I had said to my husband, I just want to go check the property before we go. I don't know. I just had a feeling. And I'm glad I did, because all the lights were blown. And I was walking around trying to figure out why we didn't have lighting. And I could hear the girls. I could hear them crying. And when I see them, they're young. They are 9 and 12 when they're there. And I just thought, gosh, why? I wonder why they're so upset. What's happening? Because normally when I'm there, especially in the spring, I'll hear them laughing and like running around and things like that. And sometimes their mother is inside in the enclosure in what I believe was the kitchen, because she looks like she's doing things in the kitchen. But when I saw the play, at the very end of the play, they had the girls, the actresses, with apples behind their backs, dropping them on the floor, making tapping noises. And I thought, oh, that's why. Great. But, my husband, at the end of the play, he then stood up and said, if you want to know the real story and the truth, ask my wife. I'm just like, oh, gosh, trying to crunch myself under the seat. But yeah, it was sad. And, not everybody has to believe it. When people come to the property all the time, and, I just hope that they come with an open mind, and experience it for themselves. Right now we're closed because it is winter time, and I don't do snow unless I have to. But the property will be back open on March 31st. I always open it up. I have an open house. You can come in. I do ask if people want a tour of the enclosure of the inside to actually schedule it. Starting in May, I work 6 days a week, so it's very difficult for me to get away. And I do like to go to church on Sunday, so sometimes, got to work that out. But it's an amazing place, and I think people need to experience it for themselves. Just to walk around the property and feel the peacefulness and the calmness, and that I have when I'm there. I don't know, it's just really difficult to describe, but it's very blissful, and it's home for me. It's home.
Now, when that original cabin was moved to Lilydale, did some of that energy kind of transfer with it? Do they get activity on that side where the cabin is?
They were. There was a rapping medium, Floyd Cottrell, and she lived in the cottage. She was in charge of it. And she would communicate with spirit. Now, whether it was the peddler or not, I'm not sure. I have never communicated with the peddler. There are a lot of spirits that come through at the property. There's quite a bit that come and go. But I've never kind of sat down and said, "Oh, Charles, is that you? Talk to me for a minute, would you?" I would love to find where he's buried. We don't know where he is. I have some theories, and I don't know. I would love to be able to honor him, for being so brave, to keep trying and keep that communication. And, I always honor him, because without him, the girls wouldn't have broken that veil to make that communication, and then been, the wonderful mediums that they were, and we wouldn't have modern spiritualism.
Right.
It could have been the Statler brothers for all we know. I don't know. I can't imagine. But it's interesting. And I don't know. I'm very, very blessed to be able to be the caretaker. And this will be my 26th year coming up next year. So
that's a long time.
Yeah.
Yep. I have one more question for you. Do you think you have some sort of like past life connection with the Fox sisters in some way? I have to ask that because you're just so connected with them.
I absolutely somehow feel that Kate Fox and I are connected. I have done transfixation, where you look into the mirror and there's a candle and you're looking to see that the transformation. When we had our church here in Newark, our previous pastor, they were all standing behind me, and they were just like, "You were Kate Fox." They saw her face. They said my hair pulled back, I had a bun, the high collar, her nose. Sometimes I know things that I don't know how I would know it unless she told me. I don't know how to describe it, but I mean, I would be honored to be a Fox family member. I've done my ancestry DNA. It's so far, none of them have popped up, but yeah, I mean, I feel like her and I connect a lot. When I need something, I go to her. Her and then my grandmother, of course. But yeah, I don't know. I hope so. I want to be.
I kind of think you do. I do. I don't feel like there's any coincidences, and there's always more meaning behind people's interests and things like that, especially when it goes this deep. So I'm a firm believer in that.
I just, I could eat, sleep, breathe. I mean, I love them, like with my whole heart. I love them. And sometimes I feel like they got a bad rap. And people, when I first started doing this, I tried to keep it very basic. Here's the story. Here's the history. Here's the facts. And then the more I discovered about the family, the more I fell in love with the family. It's like their father was a hard worker. He was a reformed, he was sober, he was reformed, he was, trying to do the right thing for his young daughters, where he already had a grown family. And their mother was very calm and very dignified. They didn't have anybody to play with other than themselves. Their older siblings were just that. They were older. They were all married. They all had families of their own. So it was just the two of them all the time. And, when I first started talking about him, I wanted to stick with the facts, but then I started to do a little more research. And then this leads to, A leads to B to C to D. And next thing you know, it's 4 a.m. and I've got, papers all over the place. And it's like, oh, wow, their brother David. He was a medium. That's interesting. Their sister Elizabeth. Nobody talks about Elizabeth because Elizabeth doesn't want anyone to talk about her. She didn't want anybody to know who her children were because she didn't want any association with this horrible thing that she felt was upon her family. So, and then I just started speaking their truth because they were young women. They deserved to be recognized. They deserved to be honored. They did a great thing. And times were hard enough. So, here on out, we're loud and we're proud.
Well, Tracy, you know what? A lot of hauntings I'm coming across that involve tragic events like that and things. I'm starting to find out that it really is that particular spirit just wants their story told.
I think that's what it is too. Yeah.
Tracy, thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Where can people find you real quick?
Ooh, well, if I'm not at the Fox property, I'm probably at my real job where I am the executive director of 5 museums in Palmyra, which is about 12 minutes from where I live. Palmyra is known for the Mormons, and we have 5 museums there. So that's where I am. Historic Palmyra, definitely. I am on Facebook. People can find me. I am Tracy Hippie Chick Murphy. No, my parents were not hippies. It is not my middle name. It is my made-up middle name. Everybody always says, "Is that your real name?" I wish.
Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
You.
You've been listening to the Gateway broadcast from the edge of the Mojave, where the strange slips through the cracks, live from United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM New Orleans. My guest tonight was Tracy Murphy. She's a medium and paranormal investigator, and she talked all about the Fox sisters in their cabin. Thank you all for listening, and until next time.